I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection for a long time, as if trying to discern not my appearance, but the woman I had become over the years, a woman who had endured too much silence, too much doubt, and too little recognition. I carefully adjusted my tie one last time, smoothing out a barely noticeable crease with my fingertips, as if the outcome of the entire evening depended on it. Everything had to be perfect, from my appearance to every word in my presentation. My materials were carefully collected in a leather folder with initials, which I allowed myself to engrave for the first time, as a sign that I would no longer hide behind modesty. Every table, every chart has been checked by me down to the smallest detail. Today, I wasn't just going to dinner, I was heading into a fight in which I was going to regain my voice, respect, and maybe my sister. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. It wasn't just another family evening. No, nothing about it was ordinary. Everything was different this time because I decided it was my time. Laura was hosting a reception in her dazzling mansion, with tall windows overlooking a garden where even the bushes seemed to have been trimmed with banking precision. In this space of luxury and refined aesthetics, I was going to present my largest project, which I had been working on alone for so many years that it became a part of me. I was hoping for Monarch Bank's support, ironically realizing that a lot depended on this support, especially considering that one of the key people there was Daniel Taylor, my son-in-law, Laura's husband. And how funny, and painful, it was to remember that it was he who, 13 years ago, coolly blew my first business idea to smithereens, calling it naive babble and a waste of the bank's time. He didn't just refuse me alone, he grinned as if I'd told him a silly story from my childhood. Since then, at every opportunity, he reminded them of this, turning family evenings into a stage where he played the role of a great savior, the man who supposedly pulled Laura out of a humble life into something brilliant. He liked to emphasize how generously he accepted her into his real family, how he raised her above those who remained below, above people like me. Every meal together turned into a performance for him, and I was not just a minor actress in it, but rather an invisible statistician whose success he diligently belittled. When I got to the door, Laura opened it for me with a smile that seemed to me to have more politeness than real joy. She pulled me to her, touched my cheek with her cheek, that same air kiss, cold as morning frost, and for a second looked at my modest but tasteful suit. "You look very professional," she said with a strange smile, in which there was something sharp, almost barely perceptible, but painfully familiar. "Daniel has just returned from Paris. Wait until you see his new French costumes," she added with a slight grin, not noticing how each of her words puts us even further apart. It wasn't just a hint of superiority, it was a whole manifesto. She now belonged to another world. And not because I was reproaching her, no, it was just that she was no longer the girl who once stood next to me at the bus stop, holding my hand when we were teased. We were too far apart, and not in miles, but in a sense of belonging to life. When I entered the dining room, I was blinded for a second by the brilliance of the chandeliers, as if the sun was reflected in crystal icicles. The room looked like an illustration from a bohemian lifestyle magazine, with furniture that seemed more like a decoration than a place where people sat, and paintings that smelled of such fake antiquity that I chuckled to myself. Like many things here, they were just imitations. In the center of this splendor, Daniel sat like a self-proclaimed monarch, proudly, self-confidently, surrounded by bankers, colleagues, and friends, each of whom was dressed as if he had come not to dinner, but to a photo shoot for the annual report. Their wives, immaculately groomed, sat next to me, talking in low whispers and looking at me with curiosity bordering on appreciative boredom. Daniel greeted me the way I should have expected, with a theatrical grin that contained everything: superiority, irony, feigned politeness. "Hey, Eric, the genius of small business has graced us with his presence," he thundered across the table, as if I were not a guest, but a buffoon invited to entertain the audience. Restrained laughter rang out at the table, not angry, but humiliating. He continued without giving me the slightest chance to recover. "Are you still running your small company? What was it called?" "Pigeon Capital." I exhaled and, keeping calm, quietly corrected, "Robinson Capital." I didn't let him confuse me. That's exactly what I came for, to talk, to show that I'm no longer the kind of woman who can be silenced with a joke. I was setting up my laptop, trying to ignore the stares. Actually, That's why I wanted to perform tonight, I began, confidently but with that inner tremor that comes when everything is at stake. I have a suggestion that I would like to share. Daniel rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair theatrically, swinging his glass of wine as if it were a golden scepter. Oh, no, he drawled in mock horror. This isn't another prank of yours, is it? He grinned and turned to Laura. Do you remember your last idea, dear? Affordable housing, isn't it? As if anyone with money would seriously invest in it. Laura laughed softly, but her laughter sounded like a taut string ready to snap. She leaned over to me and, trying not to let anyone hear, whispered, Eric, perhaps today is not the best time, and her eyes, anxiously darting over the faces of the guests, told me that even she understood that I had gone beyond my allotted role. But I didn't back down. Not one step. Not by half a ton. Because this project is not just another idea in a series of dreams, not a figment of the imagination or an illusion that can be discounted with one sarcastic comment. This was not a continuation of what they used to ridicule. It was completely different. I straightened up, putting into my voice all the strength I had been accumulating for years, like a spring holding back a stream. This project is different. This is a fully planned initiative that provides for sustainable housing, integrated retail spaces, and public spaces, I said, and, unnatural as it may sound in this vanity salon, a space where people can live, breathe, and develop. I deliberately paused, then added, the total cost is $5 billion. All we need is financing. And I believe that Monarch Bank can become a key partner. The room froze in surprise, not so much from the content as from my tone, from the way I said all this without lowering my eyes. There was a moment of deathly silence, as if the air had condensed between the table and the ceiling. And then Daniel, as if unable to stand the internal tension, burst out laughing, which burst out of his throat along with a sip of wine splashed on the snow-white tablecloth. He almost choked, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, and, still laughing, repeated, $15 billion. Are you out of your mind? His voice vibrated with sarcasm, and his eyes sparkled with amusement. You can barely afford this suit, and now you want to manage billions? He shot a glance at the guests, as if encouraging them to join in the fun. And they, like obedient extras, responded with a new wave of laughter, short, predatory, echoing off the gilded walls. But I didn't flinch. She didn't even allow herself to blink. Holding back every emotion, I looked him straight in the eye, as if everything that had been between us over the years was concentrated in that gaze. The numbers are working, I said calmly, without pressure, as a person who is so confident in himself says that he does not need to shout. You just need to take a look. I'm telling you, Daniel, I pressed a key on my laptop, and the first slide of the presentation lit up on the screen, full of colors, numbers, and graphs arranged in perfect logic. Just take a look. The numbers speak for themselves. I was about to continue, but he interrupted me with a sharp slap of his palm on the table, which made glasses and spoons clink, and the crystal pendants of the chandelier tremble. He leaned forward as if he was going to whisper a secret to me, but his voice, though quieter, was still laced with contempt. Do you want to know why you can't do it, Eric? He said, drawing out my name with a special accent, as if giving it a hint of mockery. Why are you always going to chase after these little dreams of yours, while real players are making real money? Because you don't understand how this world works. Business is not about helping people, not about your ideals or noble communities. It's about power. About control. And you, dear son-in-law, he looked around the room, as if his audience was demanding applause, you don't have it and you won't have it. He carefully, with exaggerated importance, adjusted the lapel of his new French suit, and, smiling, said with such delight that everything froze inside me, tomorrow morning I will make a report to the board of directors of Monarch Bank. And this, believe me, will be a real deal, a multi-million-dollar deal, major acquisitions, what drives this world. Not your fantasies. So do yourself a favor, Eric. Continue with your utopian projects. That's all you're good for. And again, a wave of polite, forced laughter. As if under hypnosis, everyone picked up on his mood, not realizing that they were laughing with him not at the project, but at themselves. And it was at that moment that I felt a slight vibration in my jacket pocket, short, almost imperceptible, but so inappropriate that it sounded like a drum in silence. I looked down and took out my phone, holding it up so that only I could see the screen. A new message. From my lawyer. The transfer has been confirmed. You now own 53% of Monarch Bank shares. The board of directors meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Are you ready to meet new employees? I reread the message twice in disbelief, even though I knew it was all the result of years of careful work done by me, in the shadows, in silence, away from the big wins and the covers of business magazines. I slowly raised my eyes and looked at Daniel, who was still laughing, pleased with himself, unaware that his whole reality was about to turn upside down. I didn't say a word. She just smiled, slowly, calmly, like a man who knows that tomorrow already belongs to him. The next morning, I entered the huge lobby of Monarch Bank's headquarters, carrying the same leather folder, wearing the same suit as the day before, with the difference that now I was walking not as a petitioner, but as the owner. The marble floor beneath my feet reflected the light pouring through the glass roof, as if even the building itself, this temple of capital, now looked at me differently. The guard, the one who had politely but firmly denied me access to the right floor so many times, blinked when he recognized me and took a half step back, as if his instinct had detected the change. "Mr. Robinson," said a familiar voice. I turned around and it was Evelyn, my lawyer, elegant, focused, with a folder under her arm and confidence in every step. She nodded. "Everything is ready." The council members arrived in advance. They're excited about Daniel's speech. She grinned, tilting her head slightly. They don't know yet that the agenda has changed. I walked past the reception desk with that quiet confidence that couldn't be faked. For the last 13 years, I've been playing a long game, piecing together my strategy, waiting, watching, preparing. While Daniel and his entourage were having fun, laughing at my little projects, I was building an empire. But not the one who screams about herself, but the one who enters the room one day and the whole air changes. With the help of Robinson Capital, year after year, unnoticed by an outsider, I wove a network, a complex, careful, almost invisible network of silent partnerships, legally clean but strategically verified shell companies, and transactions made through third parties who were not associated with my name, neither biographies nor bank traces. I acted in the shadows, relying on intuition and a long memory, helping those enterprises that were on the verge of destruction, reaching out to those whom the major players had written off, and it was they who, saved and restored, became my most reliable allies, eventually turning into the bricks of the fortress that I was building all this time. The time. Together we were able to achieve something that even my wildest dreams had never dared to draw before. We realized the unthinkable, and we did it in silence, in perseverance, in dedication. As the elevator glided gently upward, reflecting our calmness in the mirrored walls, I asked in a low voice, without taking my eyes off the panels, "Does anyone suspect?" Evelyn, who was standing next to me, tilted her head to the side, without looking up, and replied in an even tone, "Not a soul. Each shell company looks completely independent. Even our sources inside Monarch assure us that Daniel is more confident than ever." I nodded, allowing myself a small, almost involuntary smile. "He plans to announce the takeover of Rivera Banking Group," she added. With these words, I bowed my head slightly and, restraining my inner triumph, whispered, "Rivera is another of my quiet victories." It was a company that I had slowly, carefully, almost surgically captured through a series of seemingly random transactions, and now it stood ready, like a piece on a chessboard waiting for its turn. The elevator doors opened in front of us, and we stepped into the boardroom, a space that I once could only guess at, looking at it from afar, like a child looking at a cake display. Towering ceilings, a gleaming mahogany table almost as long as a railroad car, walls decorated with foam-colored marble, and panoramic windows overlooking the city where destinies were decided. Everything here spoke of influence and money, status and power. And at the head of the table stood Daniel, in a perfectly fitting suit, with the look of a man who is sure that the whole world belongs to him. His smug grin, the same as last night, didn't even waver when he saw me enter. He raised an eyebrow and said with a slight grin, "Eric, what are you doing here?" "This is a closed meeting." Before I could answer, Evelyn stepped forward, as if signaling the beginning of a long-rehearsed scene, and calmly, confidently placed the folder on the table right in front of him. "Actually," she said, and her voice sounded clear, professional, like an announcer reading a verdict, "Ms. Robinson has every right to be here." Daniel, still grinning, reached for the folder, opened it, and began to read, first with a slight sneer, then with a frown of perplexity. His gaze ran over the lines, and I saw his face slowly but inexorably change, first crimson with anger, then white as marble on the walls when he finally realized what was in front of him. I walked slowly over to the table, sat down on an empty chair, and said calmly, almost tenderly, "As of 9 a.m., Robinson Capital owns 53% of Monarch Bank shares." There was silence, thick and viscous, like before a storm, and then, as if someone had burst a dam, there was a noise. The members of the council, shocked, reached for their copies of documents, pages rustled, chairs rang, someone screamed, pens began to scribble like small drums. The order, the illusion of control that Daniel had been building for centuries and proudly holding in his hands, was blown away in an instant, like a house of cards that needed only one touch. "Impossible," he muttered, his voice trembling, and his eyes, having lost their former arrogance, were glued to the document, as to the text on which his life depended. But it wasn't impossible. It was unexpected. And surprise is the most powerful blow, if it is precisely calculated. His head jerked up, and his lips twitched. "Do you think we wouldn't have noticed if someone was buying shares?" He barked, but there was no longer the same strength in his tone, only a dull anger. I paused, then, with the same calmness, turned on the screen in the front of the hall. Company logos, transaction diagrams, and connection lines began to appear on a white background one after another, a complex network of organizations, partnerships, and subsidiaries, each of which seemed to have nothing in common with the other, but they all, step by step, deal by deal, led to one name, Robinson Capital. "Would you really notice?" I said softly, almost thoughtfully, looking at the screen. "You were too busy looking down on small businesses, people like me, to see what was going on right under your nose. While you were chasing big headlines, bright deals, and spotlight wins, I was bringing together the very people you were ignoring." I looked at Daniel, and his face was now a mask of bewilderment. "Those businesses that you considered unworthy of your attention, those people whom you called small players, they found each other. And now they are all under one banner. Mine." Daniel's face, which a moment ago had been confident, almost defiant, distorted by the slight grin of an omniscient man, suddenly froze in a mask of complete confusion and swift denial, as if the reality that had just been revealed to him was too absurd to accept without a fight. "This must be a trick," he barked, his voice shaking as if desperately clinging to the last shards of power. "The Taylor family has run this bank for generations," he said with the anguish with which one clings to family traditions, as if they can undo what they have done. "That's right," I replied, taking a step forward, feeling my feet getting firmer, as if every inch of the gym now belongs to me not just physically, but energetically, and during that time you made reckless decisions, pushed away those who brought stable profits, and increasingly gave priority. Surface expansion, without thinking about the strength of the foundation. Did you think these customers would just disappear, dissolve like steam? No. They came to me. Every so-called little dream that you laughed at, every startup that you refused to finance, every investment that you called insignificant, it all took shape, grew, lived, and now they are part of this reality that scares you so much." There was a heavy silence in the room, from which only the soft hum of the projector could be heard, as if the hall itself was breathing in time with the play being played out. At the table, the board members began to nod slowly, one by one, their faces reflecting shock and realization, their hands moving to the documents, their eyes following the diagrams that unfolded on the screen, showing how my network of partnerships had intertwined into something grandiose, real. Now that the mask was off, everything became obvious. While Daniel was draining the bank's resources, chasing fast profits and brilliant headlines, I was building a stable structure based not on fantasy, but on real connections, trust, and long-term relationships. My empire wasn't born out of arrogance, I said softly, almost in a whisper, it grew out of trust. Daniel lowered his head, his shoulders slumped, and he almost whispered, "You can't do that." There was no more bravado in his voice, just a hint of fright. Then he turned to Laura, as if clutching at the last straw, the one who had always been there for him. "Laura, tell him." I turned to her, to my sister, to the woman who used to hold my hand when we were kids. Yes, Laura is my sister. And maybe now, after all, she'll remember what that means. I adjusted my jacket, as if smoothing out years of understatement rather than fabric, and added, "Oh, and Daniel, there's no need to imagine a deal with Rivera Banking Group. It will not be concluded. They're already reporting to me right now." At that moment, the doors of the meeting room opened with a bang, as in the climactic scene of a theatrical play, and Laura appeared on the threshold. Her face was deathly pale, there was horror in her eyes, and her lips were trembling. "Daniel!" she screamed, and her voice cut through the air like a knife. Tears streamed down her cheeks, washing away the remnants of makeup and dignity. "Why is our account frozen?" Her voice cracked, turning into a whisper and a sob. I turned to her slowly, not with triumph, not with condemnation, but with the necessary gentleness. "That's what we need to talk about, Laura. There are violations in Daniel's personal trading accounts. Some are very serious." With these words, Daniel seemed to go limp, his body collapsed limply into a chair, and the color slowly drained from his face, making him look like the ghost of the man he once was. His luxurious French costume no longer seemed to be a symbol of success, but a costume, a theatrical shell that no longer made sense. He stared blankly at the table, muttering something as if trying to find an excuse. "All these years, you've been playing with us," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "No," I said softly but firmly, "I wasn't playing anyone. I was running a business." "Something you've never learned." The next few weeks flew by like a fever. The auditors worked around the clock, lifting old transactions from the archives, checking every line, every signature. Board meetings followed one after another, and each became a stage for new revelations. What started as a strict corporate takeover soon turned into a full-blown financial scandal. Our team of forensic accountants dug deep, very deep, and from there came decades of unethical behavior, unauthorized transactions, distorted reports, fake profits, and personal expenses hidden in strings like travel or consulting services. Taylor Banking, once a proud dynasty that seemed to be built on a solid foundation, now turned out to be an illusion, covered with a thin layer of gloss, under which rot was hidden. And when the illusion cracked, it collapsed quickly, loudly, and irrevocably. One afternoon, I was sitting in my new office, the same one where Daniel used to sit, giving orders and receiving guests, and flipping through the latest audit reports. The view from the window on the 46th floor remained the same city, the same buildings, the same endless stream of cars. But inside this space, everything has changed. Suddenly, the door was violently flung open. Laura stood in the doorway, her face filled with pain, despair, and some kind of sincere, almost childish resentment. "How could you do this to us? What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes glistening with suppressed tears. I looked up, steady, calm, without guilt, but also without triumphant glee. "No, Laura," I replied, "the real question is how could he do this to you?" Laura, unable to stand it, stepped into the office, her heels clattered loudly on the marble floor, and her face turned red. It was a mixture of rage, disappointment and, as it seemed to me, deep inner betrayal. She slammed her palms on my table so that the vase of orchids standing on the edge trembled, and with a rage that she could no longer contain, she spoke through clenched teeth, and her eyes sparkled with resentment, disappointment, and perhaps fear, not so much of what was happening as of what was happening. What was crumbling inside her? "Do you even understand what people are saying about us?" she shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. "Our friends aren't returning my calls, Eric. They're shutting themselves off. It's like I'm contagious. They act like I don't exist." I looked up from the table and met her gaze, full of pain and confusion, and looking straight into her eyes, calmly, but without a trace of condescension, I said, "Your friends? Or Daniel's friends?" And there was a whole point in those words that she probably had never dared to admit to herself before. She froze, as if someone had hit an invisible glass, stunned her. Her face froze, and her breathing stopped, as if an invisible lump had formed in her throat. "What does it matter?" she whispered, but not with confidence anymore, but with that desperate desire to return the old picture of the world, albeit fragile. "Daniel gave me everything. Status, a wonderful life, respect. He built the world I live in." I slowly got up from the table, feeling how this scene was becoming a turning point not only for her, but also for me, and walked over to the tall windows, behind which the city stretched to the horizon, flickering with reflections in glass towers. I looked at this landscape, at the thousands of lives that passed beyond our conversations, and then I turned to her and said, "Let me show you something." I took the remote control and pressed the button. A video clip from the last board meeting appeared on the screen in the back of the office. Laura slowly turned around. Her gaze was wary, and her face was tense. She watched as Daniel raised his voice, humiliating a junior analyst for a minor mistake, accusing him of incompetence in front of a room full of people. Then he interrupted an elderly board member with cold contempt when he cautiously raised the issue of questionable credit policy. His tone was icy, his words sharp, humiliating. He wasn't talking to people, but to pawns. "This is the man you've built your perfect life with," I said softly, not taking my eyes off the screen. "That's how he treats those who can't answer, who is weaker. Just like you stood in silence back in the cafeteria when he tried to humiliate me in front of everyone." Laura's face twitched. She was having a hard time keeping from crying, but I could see her lips tightening, the pain settling in the corners of her eyes. It wasn't just resentment towards Daniel. It was a grudge against myself. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "After he helped with Mom's hospital bills, I felt like I owed him. He saved us, Eric." I turned to her, standing in front of her, and my voice sounded calm, almost even, but every intonation carried the truth, from which it was impossible to hide. "No, Laura. I've paid these bills. Through one of my companies. Daniel just took out a loan under his own name. Check the financial records. Everything is there." She sank into the chair opposite, as if her legs could no longer support her, dazed, almost broken. Her expensive designer bag slipped off her shoulder and fell to the floor with a thud, the sound of which sounded like a symbol of the fall of the familiar world. She looked up, her eyes filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling like a child's. I looked at her calmly, not reproachfully, but with the quiet weariness of years gone by. "Would you believe me?" I asked. "A little brother with small dreams. The one you stopped protecting a long time ago." Before she could respond, the intercom buzzed, and my assistant's voice rang out against the background of this tense silence. "Mr. Robinson, the FBI agents have arrived. This concerns Mr. Taylor's trading violations." Laura's head shot up, and her eyes widened in horror. "Eric, please," she whispered. I put my hand on the back of her chair, sat down next to her, and said softly, "He's still your husband. And you're still my sister. That's why I arranged for him to cooperate with the investigation. He's not going to jail. There will be fines, restrictions, and his reputation will not survive. Taylor's legacy ends here. But you won't have to see him being taken away in handcuffs." Laura slowly turned to me, and there were tears in her eyes that couldn't be contained now. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "After everything he's done to you, after he's humiliated you for years, why show mercy?" I silently opened my desk drawer, took out an old, slightly worn photograph in a wooden frame, and handed it to her. It was our childhood, me, a little awkward and shy, with disheveled bangs, and Laura, standing in front of me, arms crossed over her chest, like a shield, protecting me from school bullies. She recognized this picture right away, despite the years, despite everything that had changed, despite everything that had been lost. I said softly, almost in a whisper, as if I was afraid to break the thin thread that bound us together again, "Because a long time ago you taught me that real strength does not lie in having power. It's all about how you decide to use it." Laura couldn't stand it. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry, not with a scream, not with hysteria, but quietly, deeply, as those who finally see the truth cry, from which they have been averting their eyes for too long. At that moment, my phone rang, and when, still sitting next to Laura, I took it in my hand and looked at the screen, I felt as if time had frozen into one point. A message from the board of directors. Just a few lines, but they were the finale of an entire era. Daniel has agreed to resign. His last act will be to sign the remaining shares. I read it in silence, showing neither triumph nor relief, just an inner silence that came as after a long, painful storm. It was not just an administrative step, not a change of power, it was the closure of a chapter that I had been working on for 13 years. The Taylor banking dynasty is officially over. And maybe, just maybe, the Robinson brothers and sisters, the very ones who once lost each other in the shadow of other people's ambitions, have begun to heal. A year has passed. And now, a new sign shone proudly above a tall glass building at the intersection of two main streets, Red Robinson and Partners Financial Group, the result of the very merger that I dreamed of alone, at my old desk, surrounded by folders with numbers, diagrams, hopes. It was not just a new company, it was a new beginning, assembled from the wreckage of the old world, built on the very foundations that seemed naive for so long: transparency, accessibility, care. The polished marble floors and mahogany accents remain, a memory of the bank that used to be, but the air inside has changed. There was no longer any sense of the cold inherent in the fortress for the elite, where only their own had access. The space has become brighter, warmer, more human. People were laughing in the corridors, and the junior staff did not cringe in fear when someone from the management passed by, but, on the contrary, greeted each other, asked questions, and offered ideas. The boardroom, once a symbol of exclusion, turned into an open space for dialogue. Here we now regularly met with small business owners, community organizers, and leaders of nonprofit organizations. The conversations weren't just about numbers and profits. They were now about people, dreams, and projects that could change lives. It wasn't just wealth. It was an influence. I was considering launching a microcredit program for aspiring entrepreneurs, those who had never been heard of before, when my assistant knocked softly on the door and, opening it, said, "Mr. Robinson, you have an unexpected visitor." Daniel. I paused for a moment, allowing myself a breath, and nodded. A few seconds later, he entered. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, as if he had shrunk into his own body. Quieter, more inconspicuous, not physically, but rather energetically. The presence he once filled every room with is now gone. His individually tailored French suits gave way to a simple gray jacket and shirt without a tie. Even his gait had changed. It no longer had that smug directness that had previously served him as an armor. The immunity deal I had arranged a year earlier had saved him from prison. But his career is not. His name was now only a whisper in the banking community, and most of his old friends had disappeared as soon as his empire collapsed. "Eric," he said, nodding briefly, and his voice was restrained, quiet, almost apologetic. He stopped at the door, as if hesitating to enter. "I've come to sign the final divorce papers. Laura said you have them." I motioned for him to sit down, keeping my expression neutral. "She mentioned moving to Milwaukee," I added, watching him slowly sit down, as if he had the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. "Yeah. She will work for a small consulting firm." "Very small," he said and tried to smile, but the smile turned out to be crooked, as if even she didn't know how to behave anymore. "It's ironic, isn't it?" he continued. "All those dreams that I laughed at. Small business, social financing. It turned out they weren't that small." I met his eyes. "No," I replied firmly. "Not really." He silently pulled out a folder from his worn briefcase and carefully placed it on my desk. Inside were signed documents, the final divorce papers, as well as his remaining Monarch Bank shares, now officially transferred under the terms of the agreement. It was the end, not just personal, but symbolic, wrapped in ink and paper. "Do you know what was the hardest part?" he said suddenly, and his voice became even quieter, almost confessional. "Not money. And not even a reputation. The hardest part was realizing that I had a chance to become a part of something meaningful. And I threw away this chance. Your vision, Eric. You have created a financial system that helps people, which strengthens communities. I could help you. I could have stood next to you. Not to interfere. I looked at him for a long time, carefully, and with a slight nod, I said something that no longer required accusations. Yes. You could have. He lowered his eyes, saying nothing more. And the silence that fell between us was not empty, but filled with regret, acceptance, and forgiveness. Laura seems happier now. I see it not only in the way she smiles during our conversations, or the lightness in her voice when we cross paths in conference rooms or at lunch with lawyers, but also in the way she started talking to the world again without fear of being drowned out. Her voice, once lost in the shadow of someone else's power, now sounded confident and clear, like a spring after a long winter. She founded the very children's charity that she had always dreamed of, even when we were young, and drew plans for future schools and orphanages on the bedroom wallpaper. The one that Daniel once said, without hiding his grin, that it was a waste of time. I gently reminded him of this, not reproachfully, but as a fact, as a starting point in a long journey of change. He grimaced, looked away, and nodded. Yes, he said dully, I deserve this, and much worse. He stood up, straightened his modest tie. The fabric was ordinary, restrained, nothing like the luxurious silk ribbons he used to flaunt, and looked at me one last time. His eyes were tired, but there was no emptiness in them. He finally looked like a man, and not like a mask. If it means anything. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible, not just for that night, for dinner, where I tried to make you look stupid, and for the loan you needed so badly back then, but for all of this. For all the years. For every time I chose contempt when I could choose respect. You were the best man, Eric. You always have been. Those were his last words before he walked out of my office without turning around, and maybe that was his only real act of dignity. After he left, I stood in silence, letting the silence fill the space where the voice of the past had just sounded, and then I went out into the heart of the company, to the open office floors, where life was now in full swing, where our people worked. And it wasn't just a formal hours, it was a real team built on respect, mutual assistance, trust, and not on fear, cold hierarchy, and empty veneer. I passed by familiar faces, and every glance, every greeting confirmed that this place had changed. The young analyst, the one Daniel had once humiliated in front of the entire board of directors, now headed our public relations program, organizing meetings, listening to small companies, connecting our financial empire with those for whom it was, in fact, created. An elderly member of the council, who was previously ridiculed for his caution, has now become the voice of prudence and ethics. His principles have formed the basis of our new model, a model of transparency, sustainable growth, and honest, understandable solutions. On the 12th floor, where there had once been an office overlooking the parking lot for select clients, there was now an entire wing dedicated to the Laura Foundation, my sister's charitable organization. She ran it with that calmness that comes not from money or influence, but from an inner conviction that you are doing something truly right. She was no longer interested in designer labels, private parties, tinsel. It was all gone, replaced by purpose, meaning, and finally the piece she'd been missing for so long. Laura and I sometimes had lunch together, right in my office, without waiters, without fine wines. We just sat at the table, ate, laughed, and remembered how we used to sneak into the attic as children and invent another life for ourselves. And with each such conversation, with each smile, something much more valuable grew between us than business or power. We were reconnecting. The one that seemed to have been lost forever. On one of those ordinary days, when I was preparing for a council meeting, an assistant came into my office with a folder. She looked calm, but there was interest in her eyes. The loan application, she said, handing over the file, is a small bakery in the city center. The owner, Samantha, says she met you 13 years ago. I froze. The name immediately brought back memories in me. Samantha, the woman who ran the very tiny cafe that I visited at the beginning of my journey, in those years when Robinson Capital was just a napkin dream. Back then, I couldn't even afford a cup of her coffee, and yet every time she put a hot drink in front of me, she smiled and said, "You'll return it when you can." But it wasn't really coffee she was giving. She gave faith. She believed in me when almost no one else did. I took a pen, looked at the application, and signed it without hesitation. Approved, I wrote at the bottom, with compliments from a little believer in the dream. And at that moment, as I handed the document back, I suddenly realized that the real victory wasn't to take over Monarch Bank one day or witness Daniel's downfall. The real victory was that I managed to build something that no one thought I could dream of. Something stable, meaningful, and human. Daniel once told me that business is about power. And maybe he was right about something. But he never understood what real power was. It's not something you can take away from others. That's how much you can help build. And in all this, I have already won.